Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take some of your questions, and I've got a couple this week. First one is from Nathan on the Patreon, who asks, he's really interested in Canadian foreign policy as it relates to Israel-Palestine. Do you see any MPs, especially Liberals or Conservatives, who expressed more sympathy and support for Palestinians and actions than their parties or leaders might demonstrate? And then Nathan goes on to say that it was interesting to see Yara Sachs, who is one of the MPs who just won the by-election in York Centre, and says that she made some critical comments on Israel, warranted in my opinion, and she replaced Michael Levitt, who Nathan understands to be fairly anti-Palestinian. Do I see any trends or directions from any one party or the other? Okay, so small question. First of all, let me say that the kind of general overall direction that each of the parties go is that the Conservatives tend to be fairly pro-Israel. For example, we had an instance in the last election where Andrew Scheer made one of his election promises that the country would open their embassy, or move the embassy rather, to Jerusalem rather than Tel Aviv. The Liberals try and generally kind of go down the middle. The party position is that they're looking for a two-state solution, and that these things are best negotiated by the groups at the table themselves. The NDP, meanwhile, tend to be fairly heavy in the camp that's more sympathetic to Palestinians. And quite often we hear sniping in the House of Commons around things like that. And we've seen instances where, certain news or community outlets would follow certain NDP MPs around and ask them what year the borders of Israel they believe in, and try and catch them out and things like that. So that's generally where the three parties tend to lie. In terms of individual MPs, I don't actually know too many that stray outside of their particular party boundaries. It was mentioned Michael Levitt, for example, was seen as fairly anti-Palestinian. This was actually something that, I heard some rumblings around among Liberal MPs about when he was made chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And some of them felt that it was going to be difficult for him to kind of maintain a bit of an objective stance around that. So these conversations do take place. I would just have to say that I don't know any MPs in particular who stand out on any of these particular issues, because we don't tend to focus on them a lot in Canada, and we haven't had any particular instances in recent memory where anything like that would come up, particularly not amongst the current crop of MPs. So I don't know how helpful that necessarily was, but that's kind of where things are at. Our second question is from Twitter, where Universal asks, explain the Emergencies Act and why it's a difficult thing for the PM to just invoke, especially right now. I feel like many aren't understanding why it's not as easy as just the snap of the fingers. It's a quagmire of jurisdiction and political landmines that may not actually help. Yes, this is one of the things that has been a recurring theme in the last few months actually, since the beginning of the pandemic. There's been a push among certain people and a narrative around certain media outlets that the Prime Minister can simply evoke the Emergencies Act and assert jurisdiction. And that's only partially true. One of the things with the Act, so first of all, this is what replaced the War Measures Act in the 1980s. So after the October crisis and all the kind of debate around what happened there, Parliament rather, went and replaced it with the Emergencies Act, which has a few more limits and requires things like parliamentary consultation within 7 days of the act being invoked. There are four main categories under the Emergencies Act, so public welfare emergency, public order emergency, international emergency, and war. And everyone, obviously, this being a pandemic, the public welfare emergency is certainly what everyone is kind of counting on. What makes this one of these things where the federal government can't just go and invoke it is the fact that there is actually a consultation requirement within the act. It reads, before the governor and council, meaning the governor general on the advice of the prime minister, because that's how responsible government works, issues, continues, or amends a declaration of public welfare emergency, the lieutenant governor and council of each province in which the direct effects of the emergency occur shall be consulted with respect to the proposed action. So that means, again, that the provincial government needs to have been consulted. Lieutenant governor and council is the same thing as governor general and council, meaning it's basically the premier and cabinet who are advising the lieutenant governor. And then it also goes down further. If the governor and council believes that a public welfare emergency exists and necessitates the taking of special temporary measures for dealing with the emergency, the governor and council, after such consultation is required by Section 14 proclamation, may do so. But let me just find it here. This is nuanced a little more. Because, as it says, Section 3, a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is out of proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or the authority of a province to deal with it. And that's really one of the main sticking points that people are simply ignoring when they're calling on the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with a pandemic. We don't actually see situations where it's beyond the capacity or the authority of a province to deal with. Delivery of healthcare is a provincial responsibility. The federal role in healthcare is more about ensuring equitable access across the country, which is partially why we have the Canada Health Transfers and so on. Conditions can be tied to that around, what constitutes equitable access. We've got cases, for example, around abortion clinics in certain provinces, and that's created problems. But this is, the federal role in health is generally not in delivery. They are technically responsible for delivery for the military and for First Nations. Again, most of that is done through provinces and are simply billed to the federal government. So if the federal government were to invoke the Emergencies Act for this, there's no real capacity in the federal government to do anything about delivering healthcare. And this is one of the real issues that nobody is quite figuring out. The federal government doesn't have the expertise necessary to do anything in particular that the provinces aren't. And what we're seeing is largely political choices in provinces where premiers are not taking adequate steps or moving adequate funds, or they weren't doing it 6 months ago when it would have made a difference now. And so that's partially what's at stake here. The federal, and this is why I think it's a bit foolhardy to insist that the federal government should just declare the Emergencies Act, assert jurisdiction, and start giving orders. We also have to remember this pandemic is not equal across the country. There are some regions that are hardly affected at all, particularly in the Atlantic provinces, because they've maintained much more stringent quarantine requirements. And then there's others for whom we are now seeing huge spread, and some provinces are finally going to lockdown, others are putting some milder restrictions and calling them severe. You know who you are, Alberta. And that's kind of what we're seeing. As much as I think there would be some psychological satisfaction in seeing Justin Trudeau use the Emergencies Act, declare jurisdiction, put the whole country on lockdown, I don't know how practical that actually is, because there also has to be enforcement that goes along with that. And we can't necessarily send RCMP out across the country to do that. We simply do not have the manpower for that. Let alone, and we absolutely do not want to send the military out to do that either. That is police state behavior, and pandemic or not, that is, I think, a step way too far. So again, when we're asking for the Prime Minister to make this declaration and to assert jurisdiction, I'm not entirely sure if people have an actual notion about what they want him to be doing. It sounds great, but the practical realities in the day-to-day don't really actually work like that, and that's why I think we need to be wise as to that fact. So, and back to the consultation part, this is one of these things where he can't just simply say he consulted and then just moved in without the cooperation or the request of the provinces. Because what that's going to wind up doing is simply creating a constitutional crisis, and we will be involved in the courts and lawsuits within days, and there's going to be emergency hearings at the courts and so on and so on. And there's no actual guarantee that Parliament would allow the declaration to stand. If the opposition parties all feel that this is treading on provincial jurisdiction, then they would or could easily vote it down within that 7-day period where Parliament needs to also be consulted. So that's kind of just to say, and also I guess, yeah, it's a political problem as well. This is something where, it's about trying to convince provincial governments to do their part and to step up. And I don't know that simply having Trudeau walk in with emergency powers is going to actually give that effect. I think it would actually wind up creating more problems than it actually solves in the short to medium term as well. And this is a time when we really need interprovincial cooperation and intergovernmental cooperation. And the last part of this is just a reminder that it's a constitutional division of powers in this country. So that means the federal government is given certain areas under the Constitution, and the provinces are given certain areas, and they are generally separate with minor bits of overlap. So it's not like the federal government is the parent level of government that delegated health and education to the provinces. It doesn't work like that. They were created that way separately, so they can't just swoop in as though they were a parent and take over. And we need to get this notion out of our heads, because it's causing too many people to spend their days looking to Justin Trudeau to find some kind of a solution to provincial intransigence when he doesn't have those levers. And so that means that, we as Canadians need to be pressuring the premiers to do better and step up. And I don't know that we're seeing enough of that, at least not in a concerted effort. And I think that's really what we need to take from this and to kind of move forward with that. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.